Welcome to another episode on catalyzing radical systemic change. The topic of today is meditation, pitfalls, misunderstandings, and gross oversimplifications. Why do I personally think that this is of utter importance? I think it is of importance towards the necessary steps to manifest a planetary civilization, because spirituality and meditation has become a commodity in the market. And like any commodity in the market, right, there's a lot of things happening that having secondary effects. Phony gurus, spiritual bypassing, spiritual materialism, gross oversimplifications of repackaging ancient old techniques in seemingly shortcuts for enlightenment. And I certainly know that in my very own biography, when I started to meditate at the age of 17, it was like at the very beginning of the internet. And it took me many, many, many years, and I stumbled into a lot of pitfalls up until, I deciphered like what type of technique suits my personality type. Then I did complement like shadow work, mainly therapy with meditation. And it took me many years with many spiritual teachers to understand, seemingly even realized masters, right, in an Eastern perspective, do not necessarily have their shit together at all from a Western perspective. So there's a lot to unpack in this episode, and time and again, those seeing the episode will see me look to the left. This is where in the split screen mode there are like my bullet points, because it's such a complex topic. Anyhow, enough of the prelude. It's really an honor to be with you, Diane Musho Hamilton. And like always in my podcast, I call it a soul picture, like a soul Polaroid. Tell the audience, like, who are you and what made you, finally meet in that funky Zoom room with Alistair. Happy to hand the talking stick to you.
Well, there's a very, very powerful and famous story in the Zen tradition of a great master who met with an emperor, and the emperor asked the question, "Who are you? Tell me who you are," after he had said a few things. And his response was, "I don't know." And what I can tell you is a little bit of the narrative of how I tell my story. But what brings me to this moment is, in some ways, kind of a great mystery, which is what it is that, from my perspective, makes our lives so enchanting in a way, and sometimes so challenging, because what do we really know? So I was born in the American West. I grew up a cowgirl. I rode horses, and I was very, very much a part of nature. I also enjoyed athletics and was good in school. So I had a very, average upbringing. I mean, I had within my lineage, the challenges that people of my generation had. There was poverty in my parents' background. There were war wounds, people coming back from various wars, and alcoholism, those kinds of things, so there was always, there's always the current of human suffering, even within a very normal upbringing. And then my story is that 7 of my friends died in a very short period of time. I was 17 and 4 were killed in a light plane together. Then I lost one in an automobile accident, one in a knife fight. Who was murdered, and then the other one committed suicide. So I was confronted suddenly with mortality, and in difficult ways as well. None of those deaths were natural. They were all sort of, inflicted, if you will. And so I went from having kind of ordinary considerations to having very powerful existential considerations. By the time I was a senior in high school, my questions had moved from, you might say, from the relative to the question of the absolute. What does it mean to be a human being in the face of death? how do we create a meaningful life, given that impermanence is a feature of our life. And so very naturally, I was drawn to the Buddhist tradition, because in a certain way, one of its fundamental assumptions is the need for us to look at our situation very directly, and to see that this time we have, while incredibly precious, is also impermanent. And that there's a certain way that that's the heat, you might say, under the cook pot of our life. And how do we work with that, and how do we deal with that? So my existential journey, which existential became spiritual, when I was introduced to the Buddhist tradition. So I attempted to resolve those questions through the religion of my upbringing. I also attempted to address them through philosophy and psychology. And it wasn't really until I began to meditate and the instruction to, you could say, to close the gap in a way between me and it, between me and the circumstances of my life, even between me and the question, and to become one with that question and to live that question, is where I felt the existential relaxation emerge. So meditation has been a really fundamental part of my life and my training since I was, I think, 20, maybe 18, honestly.
So thanks, Diane. I think what we both share is early in our biography, being confronted with this existential questions. Do you mind sharing more of your, let's say, professional way of training and then showing up, and also your ripening as a teacher in that specific tradition? Because I know on the back burner we have like the nuances that we want to draw or unpacking the field. So I'm curious to listen in.
Yeah, fair. So once I tasted the experience of the meditative state, that became the basis of my both my spiritual life and, I would say, my professional life. I was trained as in the field of psychology, and I began as a psychotherapist. But I very quickly transitioned to mediation because I grew up in a turbulent household, very, very dynamic, interesting, enlivened, but contentious environment. And I enjoyed the excitement of groups. And I also found that what arises in groups is really, really helpful to understand. Sometimes I think we do a lot of psychotherapy in privacy, and in a way it distorts so much of who we are is created by how we interact with others. So I got very interested in mediation. So I'm a meditator by training, and I'm a mediator by talent. I'm a more talented mediator, but I'm a very much more well-trained meditator. And so I practiced in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition until after Trungpa Rinpoche died, which I think he died in the spring of 87. So I practiced in that tradition. And then when I moved back to Salt Lake City from Colorado, then I took a job at the court system and became the director of mediation. Now, coincidentally, meditation and mediation are the same thing. You know, one is that our body, speech, and mind are recognized to be one in meditation. And in mediation, disputing parties or parties who are conflicting, our job is to actually see their underlying commonalities, the way in which they also are not separate. So I really see it as the same activity. But professionally, I'm a mediator. I work with conflict resolution. I help people with communication skills. And then, again, my private passion is meditation and spiritual practice. So I transitioned to Zen from the Tibetan Buddhist lineage because there was a Zen master here in Salt Lake City, Genpo Roshi, who I trained with. And in that time, I was introduced to, I had read Ken Wilber's work, but I was introduced to him through a meeting between Ken and Genpo Roshi that I was a part of. And Genpo Roshi had kind of synthesized this big mind process to help bring the insights of Zen meditation to a broader group of spiritual practitioners who have a lot of practice, but maybe for whom the clarity of their experience isn't quite there yet, and that this practice could really help people actually become a little bit more clear about what they're experiencing. And so as part of that introduction, I met Ken Wilber and then was hired rather immediately by his training team. And Jeff Salzman, who was in charge of his team at the Integral Institute, hired me to be one of their trainers in their integral transformative practice. So I was introduced to Ken. Ken's theory became, the water I swam in. And part of my work was to really help people have the experience of what he was talking about. So if he was talking about state changes, my job was to give people the experience of state changes. If he was talking about ever-present awareness, not a state, could they have the experience of suchness in that way? I could take them to ego, to ethno, to world, to cosmic, and show them how we naturally evolve, that it seems to be built in our hard drive to move towards, in awareness and in worldviews, that which is one set bigger than where I just happened to be. So my job was to make it all happen, make it real.
Beautiful. Let's try to put the first nugget, like $50,000 worth nugget. When you listen to this, it's worth $50,000, right? Takes you only 5 minutes. So states of consciousness and stages of consciousness. Disclaimer before I hand over to you, anybody, any spiritual teacher out there on, I think we're May still 2022, that has not at least a discernment of states of consciousness and stages of consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Is just not educated. He's just operating on an operating system like pre-monochrome. That's very polemic, obviously, from Alistair, but we want to educate the audience or invite them to educate themselves. So can you unpack or repack these two terminologies, states and stages of consciousness?
Yes, it's important that we understand states and stages of consciousness, but that we also understand that the ground of being, or ever-present awareness, or that which is fundamentally undefiled or unconditioned, always available, apparent, is not a state, because our meditative awareness doesn't change. In Zen, we say awareness itself is like the mirror reflecting all that is. So states of consciousness are extremely powerful, and they help us to grow and to change. So we can move from a state of consciousness that is very ordinary and deeply inhabiting our gross reality. Suddenly we can start to include more subtle states. And those subtle states might include emotional states, like a state of joy or a state of happiness. It could also include more subtle states of communications. Could be intuition, could be that our dreams are actually giving us messages that we're starting to include and understand. And then we might move to an even greater state that includes that which the Tibetans refer to as the very, very subtle. So subtlety includes very many things, including altered states of consciousness that we might experience. But always there's a momentum towards including more states of greater happiness, states of more well-being. There's a directionality so that states themselves can evolve, right? But the content of consciousness, the way we understand the world, our worldview, how we piece together what makes sense and what doesn't, the content of our consciousness also evolves. And this is really important and not always highly understood. Most of us think that the way we think about the world, or what comes up in awareness, what we consider, what's important to us, is unfolding in a highly unique pattern. But in fact, it turns out that developmental psychologists have established that it literally, our worldviews and our value sets unfold in a pattern. And once again, that unfolding seems to be in the direction of more and greater care, concern, and awareness, liberated consciousness for others.
Just to decipher for our audience, so there's states of consciousness and stages of consciousness. So my personal understanding of states of consciousness is, even when I sit on a meditation cushion, I have a very extraordinary, peak experience, oneness or void or clairvoyance or whatnot, right? Comes and goes. Before that, ever-present awareness. Okay, states of consciousness. Yes. Stages of consciousness are lines of development that seemingly unfold in patterns that developmental psychology can describe, which then ultimately creates almost like a grid in which we personally can understand, in which scriptures, holy scriptures, videos, enlightening moments, art, philosophy are positioned almost on a grid. Can you explain more of stages of consciousness? Because I think the states we covered, at least on the surface level.
Well, I didn't quite finish because I went to subtlety. I started to move to the causal and then to non-duality, which is the freely functioning of, you might say, of relative and absolute, or the freely functioning of awareness in all domains of experience, just free, open, available, apparent, but deeply informed by our essential nature, our true nature. Stages of consciousness levels. Okay, let's see. Well, I think the simplest way to think of it, and you can track this if you're listening. If I ask you to identify for just a moment with the egocentric self, and Alistair, maybe you can do it with me. If you identify with the egocentric self, what comes into your awareness? If you say, as the egocentric self, I notice, what do you notice?
I notice definitely that I want to continue to grow in my entrepreneurial endeavors to build a nest for my still not present future wife and the children. So that's egocentric, hopefully in a healthy sense.
Yeah, so two things are very apparent when I ask that question. One is that what I want and need is central, right? What my desires are, what my aspirations are. It could be what my limitations or my suffering is. But I is at the center, the identity that's at the center of what comes into your mind is determined by the identity of I. Now, if I ask you to identify with the ethnocentric self or the sociocentric self, and now maybe just to make it clear to your listeners, if I ask you to identify as German, for instance, let's use that identity, what comes into awareness? So as the ethnocentric German, what I notice is?
I think that's a good question. I think even before the war in Ukraine, with me being born with Germany as a mother tongue and the cultural heritage, I'm very aware of the intergenerational trauma and the intensity of the intergenerational trauma we carry as Germans. And just to stay there for a tiny moment, at least in our school system, it's obligatory that we are taught that we were kind of the perpetrators, right? So we created the Second World War, I would say also the first one, and we were responsible for the Holocaust. Thus, not only for the deaths of many millions of people, but also to the unfolding of a very diabolic nature of how ethnocentrism unfolds. So that's the one piece. The reflected piece on the collective consciousness level is that, at least on a surface level, I think we're one of the few nations that is aware of its cultural burden and its cultural inherited trauma, whereas in most other nations, at least to my knowledge, like those that colonized the vast swaths of land, right? Usually it's not taught in the school books. So often Americans tell me that they did not even know the genocide on the Native Americans. So I think that suffices, you know, to frame the ethnocentric stage of consciousness.
So, so for your listeners, what I would say is notice when he moves from egocentric to ethnocentric, what's at the center now is we, and it's not I anymore. So this could be your family, this could be your, you know, your football team, this could be your nation state, this could be, you know, your ethnic group within a nation, whatever it happens to be. But the identity shifts, and so does the boundary around what is me. So what is me suddenly just got bigger. And that's what we mean by levels developing. That's what we mean by stages as we move from I exclusively to now it's I and we, right? Now, Alistair's pointing out something very important. And lots of times it's through our difficulties that we grow. So he's saying that he grows from I to we, and that actually the German people are growing to a larger we, because they're actually including you could say the victims of the Holocaust, or they're including the suffering. And so now they're moving from an ethnocentric quality of being German, where it's us and them, you know, to a sensibility of being German that's now more world-centric. Like we're taking into account others. We're capable in a way of being responsible to our activity. We're able to see more of the implications for everyone and not just ourselves. Ethnocentrism generally stops at us. It doesn't really include you. It doesn't include them. So that's a very interesting transition that we got to experience. So now if I ask you to identify as the world-centric, what comes into your mind? Just notice what arises in consciousness, Alistair.
Yeah, me obviously being nature myself, in the middle of nature, and indistinguishable of any other living object, any other seemingly non-sentient beings. So also I'm inherently part of the mineral universe and the clouds and the oceans and the water and the magma. So I'm part of, I love this Gaia theory. I don't know, I read it very early. I must have been, I don't know, 12 or 14 when I was reading that James Lovelock piece, just because it was in the library of my father. And it was just so obvious. I mean, I was a child of a gardener's family, so that I was an intrinsic part of nature was very obvious to me. But for the sake of the exercise, world-centric for me means that none of the so-called wicked, entangled multi-crises we're facing as humanity, like climate change, proliferation of nuclear weapons, refugee crisis, erosion of soil, blah, 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 and so forth, right? Because most of our audience will agree. I would coin that world-centric because it's obvious that not Germany alone, and not even the European Union combining the nation states can solve that. We can only do this on a world-centric level.
Precisely. So when we talk about stages, we move from egocentric to ethnocentric. We still have us and them. But then when we become world-centric, we no longer have us and them. In fact, we go one step further to include the natural world, other sentient beings, life forms that are at ethnocentric are not us, but at world-centric they suddenly are. And we start to also see systems. Systemic change becomes a concept that is not there at ethnocentric. It emerges in consciousness. The United Nations emerge as a body. Suddenly, the civil rights movement in the States, the women's movement around the world, you know, all of the attempts to start to actually go one step further in treating all of humanity well as a world-centric quality. So this is a very natural unfolding that seems to be in our hard drive. It requires the right conditions, but it will occur under the right conditions. This natural growth, we naturally continue to grow through stages of self. Okay, so we're going to explore the cosmic-centric self, and I'm going to ask Alistair to identify as the cosmic-centric self. So as the cosmic-centric self, Alistair, how big are you?
I would say close to infinite, like just very, very vast.
And as the cosmic-centric self, do you have a boundary or a limit?
Not that I perceive it, at least.
No. And what are all things to you as the cosmic-centric self? Now, again, our identity is just growing in levels and stages. So as the cosmic-centric self, what are all things to you?
They're all part of me. I see like galaxies and Milky Ways and multiverses and parallel dimensions, all as part of it all.
And so is it fair to say that, well, let me ask you this question. As you identify with all things, what is the emotional texture? What does it feel like to be you as the cosmic-centric self?
Vast, expanded, empty, but also paradoxical in nature because it's full of everything, yet I'm like containing it all.
That's right. And when we talk about non-duality, we're talking about that paradox that Alistair just pointed to. And then can you see how, as the cosmic-centric self, that Alistair, as the world-centric systemic change citizen, is a part of you? And the German who's really coming to understand trauma and world responsibility, and the egocentric self who's still looking for a partner. Can you see how all those are part of you?
Yeah, absolutely. Feels actually like this matryoshka figures. It's literally, they're all stacked into each other.
Precisely. And so what we mean by levels, everyone, and then we'll finish this part of our exploration, is that we have it backwards. We think that the egoic self is the big thing, but actually our deepest nature, being one with the universe, being the universe itself, is our deepest nature. And then we care about the world. We take care of our people. We take care of our own body. And we get that in right relationship as we grow. And all of us are destined to grow. It's built into our hard drive. That's the way it is.
Thanks.
I hope that was a good experience.
I think so, because I think when it is properly cut, it was like less than 20 minutes and gives people a good understanding of discerning states of consciousness and stages of consciousness. How about we add a dash of the polemic?
Let's do it.
Alistair, I'm really curious because I'm too young, having met your first master that you did follow, but I read a lot of his books and listened to a lot of the talks of Chogyam Trungpa. So I'm phrasing it and then handing over to you. I would say that Chogyam Trungpa was fully realized, or whatever that means, but like pretty awake spiritual master. And at the same time, he had obvious shadows that now, when we look at the period of time also where Bhagwan Sri Ramesh and Adida, you know, were prominent figures, right? I don't think they could even be on stage like today. It was just part of how they manifested then and there. So I want to have you unpack, let's say, quote unquote, the path to enlightenment, the waking up piece, and shadow work.
Okay. It's biting off a lot. I think that Ken makes this point extremely clearly, which again, as the natural great ease, who we are is utterly complete. But as the being, whether you're a spiritual master or not, the content of consciousness is evolving. And so what I would say about Trungpa Rinpoche, just like what you said, is that he was a spiritual master, and some people probably would say is a spiritual master. And the work, the powerful work and the extraordinary work that he did of establishing Tibetan Buddhist teachings and practices in the West is in some ways probably unmatched. I don't know. But yes, I would not equate his spiritual power with his obstacles. For me, they're not equivalent. I see the vastness of the benefit he gave to others, and then I see that there was harm. And the harm came from addiction. Trungpa Rinpoche was a Tibetan refugee living in the West. I imagine there was some amount of emotional and psychological pain. He also had a severe automobile accident that caused him pain, and he was clearly addicted to alcohol. And then the norms around sexuality and intimacy. I think I wasn't there, so I'm not going to say too much about what went on there. People have different views about that, but that we've all evolved in terms of dual relationships, of the problems of power, of being in a powerful position with a lot of young women who are attracted and magnetized by both the power and the potency of his teaching, not being able to necessarily discern what's good for them. And so it's really up to the teacher. So those are things that are just coming, I would say, since maybe probably the 80s with HIV, with the sense of dual relationship and the problem we're seeing of the abuse of power related to sex. Those things really came into focus in the 80s, and since, sexual harassment law and whatnot. And so in a way, so much has been disclosed in our collective growth, and that those were areas now where he would be criticized and, change would be demanded of him. That's for sure. I don't have any doubt about that. But for me, the impact of his transmission is so fundamental.
Let's change a little bit the course or the pointer that I wanted to make. I give myself as an example. So I did meditate for 7 years. I had a lot of enlightening, interesting experiences in between 17 to 24. Then I read Ken Wilber, I did my sketch, and I had this, Alistair, I think you should do psychotherapy. And then I did quite a stretch of psychotherapy. The pointer here to the audience, and since you're such a decades long teacher, I wonder what things can you discover on the meditation cushion, in the ashram, in a retreat.
Sure.
And what are the things where better other techniques such as psychotherapy might really help you?
Yeah, very good. Very good. So I think the takeaway from that is that serious spiritual practitioners, meditation, and the training of a proficient lineage, I think, is central to our evolution, the relationship to a teacher, to a lineage, to a practice in an ongoing and sustained way. That's just absolutely the basis. Now, that's not to say there aren't other methods, because there are in different traditions. But in our world, one should really do psychodynamic work, meaning that working with a psychotherapist on the patterning, the very deep patterning in the body mind from your upbringing, from the cultural experience is also informing who you are. Very difficult to get a handle on without coaching and help. And in fact, in the Zen school, the Madhyamaka teaching has an emptiness side and it has a Yogacara influence. And Yogacara is really speaking to that. It's saying that the content of our consciousness and the deeply held patterns in the body and mind influence who we are, no matter how much we meditate. And those won't change without being directly addressed. So psychodynamic work is extremely important. Working on one's emotional maturity. So you can do a lot of psychotherapeutic work, but never really work with your emotional states. And so the training of how to transmute emotion, how to, if you overfeel, how to learn to feel more and use your intelligence, your emotional intelligence. And if you underfeel, or if you get swamped by feeling, how to actually moderate it and feel less is a really important part of our training. And then I think what you're getting at when you mention shadow work is that emotionally mature practitioners know that there are things about who we are and how we show up that literally can't be seen by us. They have to be seen indirectly. They have to be seen through our triggers, through our reactivity, through feedback that we get from other people, and we have to be willing to do what we call shadow work. Shadow is a word that was introduced into the psychological lexicon from Jung, and basically he defined shadow as anything that is outside the light of awareness. Ken Wilber defined shadow as anything that can't be held as I. So I'm not racist, they are. I'm not angry, you are. I'm not judgmental, they are. So what does it mean to do shadow work? It means to use a technique in which you take a kind of a backward step into the thing you don't want to identify with, right? So it could be, let me use an example of my own shadow work. Let's just because it came up, so non-judging is a value of the meditative mind. I'm not judgmental, the people I'm around are judgmental, but I'm not. Okay, if I step into that and say, okay, let me try and find the judgmental part of me. So as the judgmental person, I have a really high standards for my students. And when I see them being judgmental, I immediately judge them and ask them to change. So it's just seeing that quality in oneself that's very difficult to get a hold of. And it just becomes something we do all the time. It's not special. It's not magic. It can be magic, actually. But it just becomes a feature of the work we do because we know that we're not complete without each other. We need the reflections from others to help us let go and relax some of these deeply held patterns. Is there more that you want to add to that, Alistair? Because you've done a lot of shadow work.
Yeah. So when friends, family, clients, people that meet me ask me for advice, it's usually really super simple. For anybody that comes from a long stretch of psychotherapeutical shadow work in general, in all its forms, and then I usually say, hey, maybe it has been enough of your cleaning up the personal mess, because that's an ongoing effort, it's more like you can dedicate a lifetime to that. Maybe making a deeply transformative experience in a Vipassana retreat, right, might totally transform you. Yeah. When on the other hand, which is actually more often the case in my specific, let's say, environment, people spend 20 or 30 or 40 years on the meditation cushion, and they have never done psychotherapy, family constellation work, systemic work, somatic experiencing, Gestalt therapeutical work, then I also tell them, hey, sweethearts, the likelihood when you only dedicate a certain amount of time to work through your family upbringing, cultural conditioning, sexual patterning, right? The likelihood that you will grow. It's just, I call it like the Pareto rule. Like it seems like with just a bit of a stretch and a bit of an effort, right, a lot can happen. And then obviously, you know, the whole, you know, turning towards mastery, I think that's an ongoing, never ending, lifelong like dance, I would say. I think that's good for the shadow work piece, unless you have something to add.
Well, it becomes a little bit more challenging when we talk about collective shadow. And I think that some of what you described about Germany is that there's a willingness in the German people to actually do shadow work. And I think one of the other places in the world that we've seen that was in South Africa. They did shadow work after apartheid. And so for groups to actually begin to own parts of themselves that they don't want to own is a really amazing emergence in culture. It's really amazing. And yeah, we can trust it. I mean, I have a colleague who says that, you know, we grew ourselves into the mess we're in, and we'll grow ourselves out of it. It's the only way out is through, you know, as you're saying.
Now, just disclaimer, I will definitely record a podcast specifically on intergenerational trauma healing. It's just, I don't want to put too many, you know, topics into the room. One thing that I would love, another $1 million, you know, dollar nugget or $50,000 nugget.
Sure.
Pre-trans fallacy. I see it every day. I read it every day. I see it in videos, and it's so simple, but it seems 80 to 90% of the people either don't want to know it, or they don't even listen to a 5 to 10 minute podcast snippet. So let's make some magic happen. Liberate other beings, you know, to be able to decipher, let's say, flatland, spiritual type bypassing, simple, just esoteric, you know, I would say nonsense, or, you know, Wilbur said flying spaghetti, right? Can spaghetti fly? Sure, when I throw them. Can spaghetti really fly? Not really, because they're spaghetti, right? So please, in your very own words, pre-trans fallacy.
Well, the pre-trans fallacy happens when we mistake the exterior for what's happening in the interior. So simple example would be, you know, all soccer players or football players and fans are fundamentally really machismo and have no relationship to their receptive qualities. They're not good listeners. They're boisterous. They're, you know, all about their team and competitive, and they don't know how to shift it up. So from the outside, that could look true, but it may be that you take your average football fan who appears as a, you know, kind of a rabid competitive sports fan, and you presume that that person has no capacity to listen. They have no ability to drop their competitiveness. They have no capacity to see, you know, let's say, to care about the racial problems on the field or the way fans treat people because of racism. And because of what we pick up on the outside, we presume that it's the same, when in fact the interior is very different. So you could have a football fan that has done tremendous amount of the kind of work that you describe, and then on the outside just appears that way, and we immediately stereotype that person. So in the beginning, it looks one way, but because of the work and the experience, the life experience, actually the consciousness is in a very different place. So that's like the most dumbed down example of the pre-trans fallacy I can give. Do you have a better one that you think would illustrate it?
Try to give another example more from a teacher's, student's perspective.
Okay.
Specifically in the context of extraordinary altered states of consciousness, or when people, you know, have these deeply mystical revelations in a longer stretch of, you know, whatever, make it a 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 days, 4 weeks silent retreat. When would you put a pointer towards a pre-trans fallacy towards a student?
You know, geez, this is a really dicey question. You talk for a minute and then let me see what I have to say in response to that. So just, yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say, and then I'll see what I have to say in response.
Mm-hmm. I now need to take examples from my psychedelic experience. So as a pointer, we're not talking about psychedelic experiences here specifically. I started my psychedelic career, so to say, after 15 years of meditation, and then doing a lot of plant medicine, ayahuasca and other stuff. And specifically for those who don't have a state training as a daily practice, both how I read social media as well as people are speaking and perceiving themselves, they have all sorts of pre-trans fallacies, mainly because in my reading, right, in my understanding, trying to decipher between the lines, they're not like training their vehicle like in different typology of states on an everyday basis. So when, for example, a very commonality, especially with ayahuasca practitioners, would be this like, it's good and bad. It's black and white. Whereas I would say that, you know, what the Diamond Sutra says, like, you know, emptiness is form and form is emptiness. And I'm not enlightened, but I would say I had a couple of glimpses of that. So I know what I'm talking about. It's not that Trump is the same, like, I don't know what the name is of, I really like the minister of New Zealand, right? It's not the same like burning Jews in Auschwitz, right? And helping people when they're in dire needs. So I see an oversimplification where people take non-ordinary states of consciousness, but I also know that from people that are just meditating and they never did psychedelics, where they have an overly simplistic view on a complex reality, right? It's I would say from an epistemological point of view, just wrong, right? Like, it's not the same like shooting you in your head and abusing you and raping you, or saving people and helping traumatized women that got raped. It's not the same. It's not just not the same, right?
Yeah. Well, what's coming up for me when I hear you speak about that is we're living in a time where the pluralistic wave, the pluralistic worldview and culture is doing a good job of helping us rethink our power relationships. And one of the things that's being flattened is the student-teacher relationship. So lots of people are very, very wary of teachers because they've seen so much power abuse and so much, of teachers taking advantage of power in all the domains of sex and money, and it just goes on and on. So it's difficult in a way to enter into both into the intimacy with the teacher, but also into the challenge that a teacher will give to you. And so when I hear you talk about the prevalence of the pre-trans fallacy in people's spiritual lives, it's because they don't have a solid relationship to a teacher. So they're interpreting all kinds of experiences in particular ways that for the most part are egoically aggrandizing, keeping in mind that, like military training, spiritual training is really much of the time is about learning how to actually submit our egoic impulses and that impulse to aggrandize ourselves to something greater. When you're trained in the military, you give up your own self-identity for the well-being of your fighting force, whoever it happens to be. These are the people you're living for. That is what it is. And in spiritual training, it's learning how to submit that to a sense of yourself as greater. You become a part of the people that you're with. You become part of the world that you're in. You care about things other than yourself, and you contribute to things other than yourself. And without that relationship, my experience is that much of spiritual practice is simply appropriated into the ego. And that's why you're getting the problem you're describing.
Perfect. What better bridge to move to the next topic or hashtag?
Okay.
Spiritual materialism, as coined, coincidentally, we did not make that up, right? By the very teacher that you learned, Chokyan Trungpa, who gave a series of lectures on spiritual materialism, which one can still buy as a book. I strongly recommend it. I got it from my father again, I don't know, some 20, 25 years back. And again, when I look out there at Instagrammable, super sexy yoga, meditation for success, meditation to get richer, right? I'm sometimes literally, I look at being like targeted myself, like obviously with all sorts of, ads like meditating, be a millionaire, and all sorts of things. So I want to talk about spiritual materialism more specifically because I
always wish I was better at that.
You should.
I should be able to making a bigger, better living than I am.
Oh, please, I'll help you on that. Let's just stay in, because it's I like that when I get this like, oh, juicy Alistair energy. Is spiritual materialism is especially prevalent with those that don't have a teacher or a mentor
or a lineage
or a therapist or what?
A lineage.
Or a lineage, because they make all these amazing experiences, but not at least, once a month, once a quarter of a year, have somebody just, mirroring you all the bullshit that they see that you're doing.
Right.
Anyhow, let's talk about spiritual materialism.
It's difficult. Well, I mean, we live in a our world is a material world, Our values are highly materialistic. We've actually created tremendous prosperity for many, many people on the globe, and even the people in poverty are somehow slightly better off than they were 100 or 150 years ago. So, there's something about our material circumstance that's super compelling to us, and it's very, very easy to substitute that material satisfaction for what is a genuine what's the word? Just putting ourselves in relationship to something greater. There's so much letting go involved in that. And without a really solid container, our impulse always is to grasp. Grasping is the natural thing. We want more, we want better, we want different, we want other, we want to be excited, we want, we want, which was the Buddha's fundamental insight, is that desire is so primary. And so we're engaged in wanting, or not wanting. And there's just this encouragement to relax that impulse and to not go along with the cultural programming of at every turn, branding ourselves, aggrandizing ourselves, promoting ourselves. It's just literally in opposition to genuine spiritual practice. And I find it a really challenging and difficult environment for that reason. It's very hard to be a contemporary person and participate in the world and still have a practice that seems kind of medieval. And, how do we do that? But that is in Zen, we would say that's the koan that we're living. So without a context or a community or a teacher who's actually going to really help you in those moments where you're just engaged in that, you could call it like building up of self, we're just bound to do it. That's just what we do. We're not bad, we're not wrong, but we are wrong, actually. It's not the true nature of things. And it's not where we find our freedom. We find our freedom in tasting what you were showing us in the cosmic-centric self, that there's a part of us beyond space and beyond time that includes all things. And because it includes all things, the response is compassion. And the gesture is one of inclusion and gentleness. And it's naturally arising. It's not put on through your Instagram account and through whatever quote it is that you're putting up during the day. You know, I personally just don't have the talent for social media. I don't know how to do it without doing all that. So I just don't do it. So that's something for your generation to figure out.
Yeah, disclaimer here for the audience. I've not prepared that at all. I have the feeling also almost inverting spiritual materialism and inviting people to show up and get successful in the sense of showing up with their full potential, not finding reasons to shy away, carving their niche out, making a difference. Because what I see is it's a weird paradox. I know so many people that have beautiful values. They've done an awful amount of inner work and spiritual work and psychodynamic work, and they don't really unfold what I would say on a both cultural dimension as well as systemic dimension, and equilibrium to those who simply say, oh, okay, like meditation-based stress reduction. I'm a successful consultant. Okay, in the next 3 years, I built, a company and I sell meditation-based stress reduction to Fortune 500 companies. What I mean with that, and I don't know how much of this paradoxical nature of our conversation people can hold, I think there's an unhealthy spiritual materialism, right? This is mainly what we were referring to, an inflating of the ego. But there's also, I don't know what terminology I would use, there's also an unconsciously not showing up and being overwhelmed, where I would say the growing up and showing up for so many beautiful souls out there is direly needed. And for that, they need at least financial abundance in the sense of not being caught up totally in the rat race, right? Because if not, how can you creatively express yourself?
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I've seen some schools of thought differentiate between enlightenment teachings and empowerment teachings. And I think that that's what you're hitting on here. And in some ways, there could be too much grasping, but what you're saying is, in a certain way, we're shying away from our natural capacities to contribute. And so that we also need help in learning how to manifest. We need to realize more fundamentally who we really are. And then we also need to be able to manifest that so that we can support others and, spread the good word, as they used to say. And that people may need help and coaching and support around that. So that makes sense to me. Totally.
I know we already touched upon that topic, but I nevertheless want to sketch a last bullet point or header, which is spiritual bypassing. And I've definitely know that I've been doing everything possible to spiritual bypass anything for, I would say, maybe close to a decade or so. So spiritual bypassing is just a terminology which is coined that we're using spiritual techniques, feeling bliss or peace or security or whatever, right? To avoid actually our difficult life. Could be finishing your studies or trying to understand why certain patterns in relationships always show up, or addiction issues. So it's obviously related to the topic of shadow work. Just the nuance is a bit different. And again, I see a lot of spiritual bypassing out there in the market. A classical example would be people that always, smile. And whereas you have the feeling they're actually sitting on a whole volcano of unprocessed, emotions such as anger or envy or something like that, but they're always smiling. So yeah, maybe your 2 cents on spiritual bypassing before we find a beautiful closing of that episode.
Well, the spiritual practice is itself built on the capacity for what we would call renouncing or disidentifying, meaning that, you know, prior to practice, I am my anger, I am my thoughts, I am my wants and needs, I am all this drama, I am all these things. And with a certain amount of instruction and practice, we suddenly start to say, oh, actually, I don't have to identify with that. I can be free of that. I might even experience a deeper sense that it's all empty and it's not my additional attachment and commentary and contribution to the drama is really not necessary. So I see it as a very healthy stage in practice, but it's a very incomplete stage, because without being able to integrate and also see that it both is me and isn't me, if I am everything, how could it not be me? And if it is me, then how do I show up in a way to contribute positively to, you know, as we would say, to behave with wisdom and compassion for the benefit of the whole? Like just being disidentified is a renunciate path. And maybe that's a path that someone chooses to take. But that path usually results in you being in a cave, not being in the world, behaving as though the world isn't you. So that might be one way to think about it.
Beautiful. To close our session, imagine you're at the beginning of your spiritual journey and you're searching for almost like a compass or a guide, or you're in the middle of the journey and you have done some work. What would be, out of the whole conversation, if you were to break it down into like 3 to 5 takeaways, what would that be?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that your one spiritual nature is the guide, and that everything that has come my way that I've been able to make use of didn't come because I had an idea. It came because it showed up and I was responsive. So we can trust ourselves, but that to be within some sort of a lineage tradition, to have really reliable guides, to have friends and community people that can help you, and to understand that the path includes pain and challenge, and we have to have resilience and we have to be anti-fragile, is because that's the neighborhood we play in. You know, it's a rough world. And so one has to develop a certain amount of toughness to be a genuine practitioner. And then finally, just to know that, as I began by saying, that, you know, our life is a tremendous gift and it's also a very profound mystery. And so just to be in awe of it, you know, that as you started out by saying, you know, how did we end up here together? How miraculous and how wonderful. And that my experience has been is that the more I submit myself to practice, the more beautiful and wondrous my life has been. And I feel extremely confident in that. So I really am so glad we met.
No, thanks for your closing words. I think, I don't know if that's impolite, but I feel I want to add some of my
please. No, not at all.
Polemic rant style.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you.
So anybody selling or trying to sell you full realization in a 3 or 10-day retreat, right? It's just lying. Anybody that can't distinguish states and stages of consciousness is literally just operating pre-internet, pre-monochrome, pre-mouse, pre-anything, you know? So I'm
pre-modern.
Yeah, exactly. I know in our terminology, I'm really just literally baffled who shows up as teachers after having had their first, which is normal, right? I mean, in all Zen teachings, Buddhist teachings, and Hindu teachings, they would say you have the first glimpse of liberation, you know, so you're sitting for 3, 5, 7, 10 years, and then you have, like, I got it, like, and then you're back again human, right? And I find it so interesting how many people show up everywhere where I would say, hopefully, I would say I had a lot of enlightenment experiences and beautiful, but I'm still mainly Alistair. And I don't know, I don't know why I don't feel drawn towards becoming a spiritual teacher, but I still feel like I'm learning and growing and integrating and healing and showing up. So I'm like somewhere in the middle. I'm not a total beginner, I would say.
Yeah.
But I would never give myself permission to show up on stage and tell people, oh, you know, it's like emptiness is form and form is emptiness, you know. So there's this part, which is a rather fun part.
Somebody's got to do it.
What?
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, somebody got to do it. The other part is maybe that's I hope the main takeaway for those who made it towards the very end. If I were to, actually, maybe that's a beautiful metaphor to end it from my side. If spirituality and meditation were to be a language, sure, you can learn a language just talking. I'm not saying that's not possible, right? As an adult, but maybe studying some grammar, right? And having a teacher that mirrors you back, you know, how you constantly keep on repeating, making the same mistakes, will simply help you on your path of proficiency in that foreign language. And I have the feeling it needs a lot of humility to get a teacher, to get a mentor, to get a guide, to get a master, to constantly basically show you, okay, back to basics, back to practice. So I think, yeah, that's my closing words. Do you feel drawn towards sharing some last closing words?
I just feel it's very conventional, but my last closing words are thank you. Yeah, thank you for being you. You're just wonderful, and you have a lot to offer. You know, you've thought about these things really deeply, and you've experienced them, and the genuineness with which you share is really, really of benefit. So I just want to appreciate you for your podcast and for your warm human heart. You know, it's like there's spiritual practice, there's the reliability of the heart, and then there's just doing some ethical training. You know, those things help. So
thanks so much, Diane.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.